When you're a child, you trust the people around you. The people who are supposed to guide you, protect you, and help you grow into the person you're meant to become. You look up to them with innocent eyes, believing that they have your best interests at heart. But what happens when the person you trust the most, the person you're supposed to learn from, betrays you in the worst possible way? What happens when the very foundation of trust is shattered, leaving you alone in a world that suddenly feels dangerous and unpredictable? That's what happened to me. My teacher, the one who was supposed to protect and teach me, abused me in the classroom. And for years I couldn't speak up. I was too afraid to tell anyone what was happening. My name is Betty, and I'm sharing this story not for sympathy, but for understanding. I'm sharing it for every child who has ever felt trapped in silence, for every person who has carried the weight of abuse on their shoulders, and for every survivor who is still searching for their voice. This is the story of how my childhood was stolen from me, how I stayed silent for far too long, and how I found the courage to finally speak out. And it's a story for anyone who has ever been silenced by fear. I was 10 years old when it began. 10 years old, just a little girl with pigtails and a love for reading, who believed that school was a magical place where knowledge bloomed and friendships flourished. I remember the excitement I felt each morning as I put on my school uniform, carefully smoothing out the wrinkles and making sure my shoes were polished. Education was important in our family. My parents had worked hard to give me opportunities they never had, and I wanted nothing more than to make them proud. The school building itself was old but well-maintained, with tall windows that let in streams of golden sunlight during the afternoon classes. The hallways smelled of chalk, dust, and floor polish, mixed with the faint aroma of cafeteria food. I can still hear the echo of children's laughter bouncing off the walls, the shuffle of feet during class changes, and the sharp ring of the bell that marked the beginning and end of each period. It was supposed to be a safe haven, a place where children could learn and grow under the watchful eyes of caring adults. Mr. Taylor had been teaching at our school for 15 years. He was respected in the community, known for his strict but fair approach to education. Parents praised him for his dedication, and other teachers spoke highly of his methods. He had graying hair at the temples, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and always dressed impeccably in pressed shirts and ties. To the outside world, he was the epitome of a devoted educator. But I learned that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear the faces of those we're taught to respect and obey. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I dismissed it as my imagination. Children often misinterpret adult behavior, don't they? That's what I told myself when his hand lingered too long on my shoulder, when his fingers traced patterns on my back as he leaned over to check my work. I told myself I was being silly when I felt uncomfortable with the way he looked at me, different from how he looked at the other students. There was something in his eyes that made my stomach turn, but I couldn't put words to it. I was just a child. I didn't have the vocabulary to describe predatory behavior. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the small gestures became bolder. The innocent touches became deliberate violations of my personal space. The compliments on my schoolwork transformed into comments about my appearance that made me want to disappear into the floor. I began to dread his class, counting down the minutes until I could escape that room. But escape was temporary. The next day would come, and with it, another 45 minutes of trying to make myself invisible while sitting in the front row where he had strategically placed me. I want you to understand something about abuse, especially when it happens to children. It doesn't always come with bruises or scars that others can see. Sometimes the wounds are invisible, carved into your psyche with surgical precision. The abuser knows exactly how far to push, exactly what they can get away with. They're master manipulators who understand that a child's fear of not being believed is often stronger than their desire to seek help. They count on our silence, feed on our confusion, and thrive in the shadows of our shame. Looking back now, as a grandmother with silver hair and weathered hands, I can see all the signs that the adults around me missed. Or perhaps they didn't miss them at all. Perhaps they simply chose not to see. It's easier to maintain the status quo than to confront an uncomfortable truth. It's simpler to dismiss a child's discomfort as shyness or oversensitivity than to question why a respected teacher's behavior might be inappropriate. The system that was supposed to protect me became complicit in my suffering through its willful blindness. This story isn't just about what happened to me in that classroom. It's about the ripple effects of trauma, how it shapes the person you become, the relationships you form, and the way you move through the world. It's about the journey from victim to survivor, from silence to speech, from shame to strength. Most importantly, it's about breaking the cycle, ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to another child. So I invite you to listen, really listen, as I take you through the darkest period of my childhood and show you how I found my way back to the light. This isn't an easy story to tell, and it won't be an easy story to hear, but it's a necessary one. Because somewhere out there, a child is suffering in silence, believing they have no voice, no power, no hope. And maybe, just maybe, my story will reach them and let them know they're not alone, that their voice matters, that they deserve to be heard, believed, and protected. The morning of September 3rd, 1962, began like any other school day. I remember it with such clarity that it might have been yesterday instead of decades ago. The sun was already warm at 7:30 in the morning, promising another hot day in our small Midwestern town. I ate my breakfast of oatmeal with brown sugar, kissed my mother goodbye, and walked the 6 blocks to Jefferson Elementary School with my best friend, Mary Catherine. We talked about everything and nothing, the way 10-year-old girls do, our voices mixing with the chirping of birds and the distant sound of lawnmowers starting up for the day. Jefferson Elementary was a brick building that had stood in our community for 40 years. It had educated generations of children, including my own mother and her siblings. The floors were polished wood that creaked in certain spots, and the walls were painted a pale institutional green that somehow managed to look both cheerful and depressing at the same time. There were 24 classrooms, a library that smelled of old books and lemon polish, a cafeteria where the lunch ladies knew every child by name, and a playground with swings that squeaked when you pumped your legs high enough to touch the sky. My classroom was on the 2nd floor, 3rd door on the right, room 207. Even now those numbers make my chest tighten. The door was heavy wood with a frosted glass window that had Mr. Richard Taylor, 5th grade, painted in neat black letters. When you walked in, there were 6 rows of desks, 4 desks to a row. The chalkboard stretched across the entire front wall, and above it hung the alphabet in cursive letters that we were still learning to perfect. There were pull-down maps of the world and the United States, a globe on a stand in the corner, and shelves filled with encyclopedias and approved reading materials. Mr. Taylor's desk sat at the front, slightly to the left, positioned so he could see every student without turning his head much. It was a massive oak desk that seemed to emphasize his authority. On it, he kept his grade book, a cup full of perfectly sharpened pencils, a small American flag, and a wooden apple that some student had given him years before. Behind his desk was a more comfortable chair than ours, with armrests and a cushion. He rarely sat in it during class, preferring to move around the room as he taught. I was assigned the 2nd seat in the 1st row, directly in his line of sight. At first, I thought this was an honor. Good students sat in the front, where they could see the board clearly and participate in lessons. My parents were pleased when I told them about my seat assignment. They saw it as recognition of my academic potential, a sign that Mr. Taylor had identified me as a student worth nurturing. How wrong we all were. Mr. Taylor had a way of making learning seem important and urgent. He spoke with authority about everything from mathematics to history, from science to literature. His voice carried well, filling the classroom without him having to shout. He had this habit of walking between the rows as he lectured, his footsteps measured and deliberate. Sometimes he would stop beside a student's desk to make a point, resting his hand on the back of their chair or lightly on their shoulder. It seemed natural, a way of including everyone in the lesson. But with me, it was different. When he stopped at my desk, his hand didn't just rest briefly on my shoulder, it lingered. His fingers would move slightly, almost imperceptibly, tracing small circles through the fabric of my dress. The first time it happened, during a lesson on long division, I thought perhaps I had imagined it. Surely a teacher wouldn't do something inappropriate. Surely I was misunderstanding a gesture meant to be encouraging. As days passed, the touches became more frequent and more deliberate. When he returned graded papers, he would lean over my desk longer than necessary, his body close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with coffee and chalk dust. His hand would brush against my arm, my back, my hair, always in ways that could be explained away as accidental, always when other students were focused on their work and wouldn't notice. I began to develop strategies to avoid his attention. I would slouch in my seat, trying to make myself smaller. I would time my pencil sharpening for moments when he was engaged with students on the other side of the room. I learned to keep my eyes down, to never raise my hand even when I knew the answer, to become as invisible as possible while sitting in the most visible seat in the classroom. But invisibility was impossible. Mr. Taylor had chosen me for reasons I couldn't understand then and can barely stomach now. He would call on me even when my hand wasn't raised. He would ask me to stay after class to discuss my exceptional work, though my grades were good but not extraordinary. He would find reasons to keep me in during recess, claiming I needed extra help with assignments I had already completed correctly. Those moments alone with him were the worst. When the other children filed out for recess, their voices fading down the hallway, the classroom would feel enormous and suffocating at the same time. He would pull a chair close to my desk, too close, and go over my work with exaggerated care. His knee would press against mine under the desk. His hand would rest on my back, moving in slow circles that made my skin crawl beneath my clothes. He would speak in a lower voice, telling me how special I was, how mature for my age, how he saw potential in me that others might miss. I didn't have words for what was happening. At 10 years old, my understanding of inappropriate behavior was limited to knowing not to take candy from strangers or get into cars with people I didn't know. But Mr. Taylor wasn't a stranger. He was my teacher, a respected member of the community, someone my parents spoke about with admiration. When he touched me in ways that made me uncomfortable, when he said things that made me feel strange and ashamed, I didn't know how to categorize it. I only knew that it felt wrong, that it made me want to run away and never come back. The physical symptoms began almost immediately. I developed stomach aches that had no medical cause. I would wake up on school mornings feeling nauseous, sometimes actually vomiting from anxiety. My mother took me to our family doctor, who could find nothing wrong. He suggested I might be nervous about school, which was normal for children. He prescribed rest and perhaps a little less pressure to excel academically. My parents, thinking they were helping, told me it was okay if I didn't get perfect grades, that they just wanted me to do my best. But grades weren't the problem. The problem was sitting in that classroom day after day, feeling his eyes on me, knowing that at any moment he might find a reason to come close, to touch, to whisper things that made me feel dirty and confused. The problem was the war between what I had been taught about respecting authority and the growing certainty that what was happening was wrong. The problem was that I was 10 years old and completely alone with a secret I didn't know how to share. The classroom that should have been a safe space for learning became a daily torture chamber. The alphabet letters above the chalkboard seemed to mock me. The books on the shelves that had once promised adventure and knowledge now felt like prison walls. Even the sunlight streaming through the tall windows couldn't penetrate the darkness that was settling over my young life. Every morning, walking up those stairs to the second floor felt like climbing to my own execution. Every afternoon, escaping to go home felt like a temporary reprieve before the next day's ordeal. This was how my 5th grade year began. In a classroom that should have been safe, with a teacher who should have been trustworthy, learning lessons that had nothing to do with the curriculum and everything to do with power, fear, and the terrible vulnerability of being a child in an adult world that doesn't always protect its young. October arrived with a burst of color that painted our small town in shades of amber, crimson, and gold. The maple trees that lined the street outside Jefferson Elementary had transformed into living flames, their leaves dancing in the cool autumn breeze. It had been 6 weeks since school started, 6 weeks of daily dread, 6 weeks of Mr. Taylor's increasingly bold behavior. But nothing had prepared me for what would happen on that particular Thursday afternoon in October. The day had started normally enough. I had managed to eat a piece of toast for breakfast without feeling sick, a small victory that made my mother smile. I had completed all my homework the night before, double and triple checking each answer to avoid giving Mr. Taylor any reason to keep me after class. I wore my favorite dress, a blue cotton one with small white flowers that my grandmother had made for me. Looking back, I wonder if I thought that dress could protect me somehow, like armor made of innocence and love. The morning lessons passed without incident. We studied the 13 original colonies in social studies, practiced multiplication tables that I already knew by heart, and read aloud from our reading textbook about a family's adventure in the Oregon Territory. Mr. Taylor seemed distracted, spending more time at his desk than usual, occasionally glancing up at the class with an expression I couldn't read. I allowed myself to hope that perhaps he had lost interest in tormenting me, that maybe I could fade into the background like I so desperately wanted. Lunch was tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, the comfort food combination that usually made Thursday bearable. I sat with Mary Catherine and 2 other girls from our class, listening to them chatter about the upcoming Halloween party while I picked at my sandwich. They were excited about their costume plans, debating whether it was better to be a princess or a witch. I nodded and smiled at the right moments, but my mind kept drifting back to the classroom, to the afternoon lessons that waited for me like a threat. When we returned from lunch, Mr. Taylor announced that we would be working on individual creative writing assignments. The topic was my favorite season, and we had 45 minutes to complete a 1-page essay. This should have been easy for me. I loved writing, loved the way words could paint pictures and tell stories, but as I sat at my desk, pencil poised over the blank paper, I found myself frozen. Every time I tried to focus on describing autumn's beauty, I felt his presence in the room like a weight pressing down on me. 20 minutes into the writing period, he began his walk around the classroom. I could track his progress by the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor, the occasional murmur of encouragement to a student, the scrape of his hand on desk edges as he moved. My pencil moved frantically across the paper, writing words I wasn't even reading, just trying to look busy, trying to avoid drawing his attention. But I knew he was coming. I always knew. It was like being prey that could sense the predator circling closer. My shoulders tensed as his footsteps approached my row. My handwriting became shaky as he paused at the desk behind mine. And then he was there, standing beside me, his shadow falling across my paper like a storm cloud blocking the sun. "Let's see how our little writer is doing," he said, his voice carrying that false warmth that made my stomach clench. He leaned over, supposedly to read my essay, but his position was all wrong. Instead of standing beside my desk like he did with other students, he moved behind my chair, leaning over my shoulder, his body forming a cage around me. His hand came to rest on my shoulder, then slid down to my upper arm. I tried to keep writing, but my hand was trembling so badly that the words were illegible. I could feel his breath on my neck, could smell that mixture of cologne and coffee that would forever make me feel sick. His other hand came around, ostensibly to point at something on my paper, but instead it brushed across my chest in a way that was absolutely not accidental. I froze. Completely, utterly froze. Like a rabbit caught in headlights, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Time seemed to slow down, and I became hyper-aware of everything. The scratch of pencils on paper from other students, the tick of the clock on the wall, a bird singing outside the window, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears like thunder. "This sentence needs work," he said, his voice so normal, so teacher-like, that for a moment I wondered if I was going crazy. Was I imagining the way his hand was moving? Was I making something terrible out of nothing? But then his fingers pressed harder, more deliberately, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was real, this was happening, and this was wrong. "I'll help you fix it after class," he continued, finally straightening up and moving away. The relief I felt as he walked to the next student was so intense that I almost sobbed. But I couldn't cry. Not here, not where everyone could see. I gripped my pencil so tightly that my knuckles turned white and forced myself to keep writing, though the words blurred through the tears I wouldn't let fall. The rest of the writing period passed in a haze. I have no idea what I wrote about autumn or favorite seasons or anything else. All I could think about was the bell, willing it to ring, praying for the day to end so I could escape. But even as I prayed, I heard his words echoing. After class. He wanted me to stay after class. When the bell finally rang at 3:15, the other students packed up quickly, eager to head home or to after-school activities. I moved slowly, deliberately, hoping that if I took long enough, he might forget or have another appointment. But as the classroom emptied, he looked directly at me and nodded toward my desk. The message was clear. Stay. Mary Catherine waited for me by the door, but Mr. Taylor told her I would be a few minutes, that I needed help with my essay. She shrugged and left, promising to wait for me outside. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell locking. We were alone. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to what was about to happen. The classroom that had felt merely uncomfortable with other students present now felt dangerous, like being locked in a cage with something that pretended to be human but wasn't. "Bring your essay here," he said, gesturing to his desk. I stood on shaking legs and walked the few feet that felt like miles. He was sitting in his chair now, and he patted his knee. "Sit here so we can go over it together." I shook my head, unable to form words. He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew they had all the power. "Don't be shy, Betty. You're such a special girl, so mature for your age." Those words, mature for your age, I would hear them in my nightmares for years to come. They were the words predators used to make children feel complicit, to make us feel like we had somehow invited this attention. They were words designed to confuse and manipulate, to make a child feel simultaneously special and ashamed. When I didn't move, he reached out and pulled me closer, not onto his lap but standing between his knees. His hands went to my waist, holding me in place while he pretended to look at my essay. But he wasn't reading. His hands were moving, touching me through my dress in ways that no adult should ever touch a child. I stood there, frozen in shock and terror, my mind screaming while my body remained paralyzed. "You're trembling," he said softly, his hands still moving. "There's nothing to be afraid of. This is what happens when a teacher sees potential in a special student. But this is our secret, Betty. Good girls keep secrets." The violation continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When he finally released me, told me I could go, I grabbed my books and ran. I ran out of the classroom, down the stairs, past a confused Mary Catherine, and all the way home. I ran like something was chasing me, because in a way, something was. The innocent child I had been that morning was gone, replaced by someone who knew too much, who carried a secret too heavy for 10-year-old shoulders. When I got home, my mother asked why I was out of breath, why I looked so pale. I told her we had races in PE, and she believed me because why wouldn't she? I was her daughter, her good girl who never lied. But I was lying now, and I would continue to lie, because Mr. Taylor had made me complicit in my own abuse. He had taken my voice along with my innocence, and I didn't know how to get either of them back. That night, I threw my favorite dress in the back of my closet and never wore it again. I scrubbed my skin raw in the bath, trying to wash away the feeling of his hands. And I lay awake staring at the ceiling, knowing that tomorrow I would have to go back to that classroom, back to him, and pretend that nothing had happened. Because good girls keep secrets, and I was still, despite everything, trying desperately to be good. The weeks following that October afternoon blurred together into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Each day became a careful dance of avoidance and survival, but no matter how hard I tried to stay invisible, Mr. Taylor always found ways to corner me. The abuse that had crossed a terrible line that Thursday continued and escalated, becoming a horrifying pattern that defined my 5th grade year. He had established a routine that appeared innocent to anyone watching. Extra help sessions after school. Special assignments that required one-on-one attention. Reading groups where somehow I always ended up being the only student who needed additional guidance. To the outside world, Mr. Taylor was simply a dedicated teacher taking extra time with a student. To me, he was the monster who had stolen my childhood and replaced it with fear. The physical symptoms of my trauma multiplied. The stomach aches that had started in September became constant companions. I developed headaches that would last for days, making it hard to concentrate on anything except the pain. My appetite disappeared almost entirely. My mother would pack lunches that I would throw away untouched, unable to stomach food when my insides were twisted with anxiety. I lost weight, my clothes hanging looser on my already small frame. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, dreading the sunrise that would mean another day in his classroom. When I did finally fall asleep, nightmares would jolt me awake. Sometimes I dreamed about running, but my legs wouldn't move. Sometimes I dreamed about screaming, but no sound would come out. Always I woke up sweating and shaking, my heart racing like I had run a marathon. My grades began to slip, which only gave him more ammunition. He would express concern to my parents about my declining performance, suggesting that I needed more individualized attention. My parents, trusting him completely, agreed readily. They were grateful to have such a caring teacher who was willing to go above and beyond for their daughter. If they noticed that I had become quieter, more withdrawn, they attributed it to the academic struggles Mr. Taylor had so helpfully pointed out. The abuse took many forms, each one chipping away at my sense of self, my understanding of safety, my trust in the world around me. There were the touches that happened during class, subtle enough that no one else noticed, but deliberate enough that I knew they were intentional. A hand that lingered too long on my shoulder. Fingers that would brush against me as he walked past my desk. The way he would stand too close when examining my work, his body pressed against my chair. But it was during those after-school sessions that things were worst. With no witnesses, he became bolder. He would lock the classroom door, he said, so we wouldn't be interrupted. He would pull the shades down partway, claiming the afternoon sun was too bright, and then he would create situations where physical contact seemed necessary, helping me with handwriting by holding my hand as I wrote, showing me the proper posture for reading by adjusting my position in the chair, his hands roaming where they shouldn't. He was careful never to leave marks, never to do anything that would provide physical evidence, but the psychological wounds he inflicted were deep and lasting. He would tell me this was normal, that all special students received this kind of attention. He would say that I must never tell anyone because they wouldn't understand our special relationship. He would alternate between praise and implied threats, keeping me off balance, never knowing if I would face the caring teacher mask or glimpse the predator beneath. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest part. I couldn't tell my parents, who thought Mr. Taylor was wonderful. I couldn't tell my friends, who wouldn't understand and might not believe me. I couldn't tell other teachers, who were his colleagues and friends. I was trapped in a prison of silence, serving a sentence for a crime I didn't commit, with no hope of parole. I developed coping mechanisms that no 10-year-old should need. I learned to dissociate during the worst moments, to send my mind somewhere else while my body endured what it had to endure. I would focus on a crack in the ceiling, counting the tiny lines that spread from it like a spider web. I would recite multiplication tables in my head, or try to remember all the state capitals, or mentally sing songs from Sunday school. Anything to avoid being fully present in those moments. My behavior at home changed dramatically. I became obsessed with locks, checking my bedroom door multiple times before bed even though I knew it didn't lock. I started wearing layers of clothing even when it wasn't cold, trying to put as many barriers as possible between my skin and the world. I flinched when anyone touched me. Even my mother's gentle hugs or my father's proud pats on the shoulder. They noticed, of course, but Mr. Taylor had planted the seed that I was going through a difficult phase academically, and they attributed all changes to that stress. At school, I became a ghost of my former self. Where I had once been eager to participate, I now sat silent. Where I had once played with friends at recess, I now found corners to hide in with a book, building walls of words between myself and others. Teachers commented that I seemed withdrawn, but Mr. Taylor was always ready with an explanation about my struggles with the advanced curriculum he was providing. The holiday season arrived, and with it came class parties and festivities that should have been joyful. But even celebrations became opportunities for him to get close to me. During the Christmas party, while other students were distracted by cookies and punch, he found reasons to stand near me, to accidentally brush against me, to whisper comments about how pretty I looked in my holiday dress. I stopped wearing dresses after that, insisting on pants despite my mother's confusion at the sudden change in preference. January brought a new horror. Parent-teacher conferences. My parents scheduled their appointment for after school, and Mr. Taylor suggested I wait in the classroom while they met. For 30 minutes, I sat at my desk, listening to him tell my parents how concerned he was about me, how I seemed anxious and distracted, how my potential was being hampered by some unknown issue. He suggested perhaps I was being bullied by other students, or maybe there were problems at home. My parents, worried and feeling guilty that they hadn't noticed their daughter struggling, assured him that everything was fine at home and thanked him for his concern. After they left, he kept me for another tutoring session, during which he told me how disappointed he was that I was making him lie to my parents. If only I could be a better student, more cooperative, more understanding of the special attention he was giving me, then he wouldn't have to worry them. The manipulation was masterful, making me feel responsible for his lies, guilty for his actions, ashamed of my own existence. Winter turned to spring, and with it came standardized testing. The stress of the tests combined with the ongoing abuse pushed me to a breaking point. During one test, I simply couldn't function. My hands shook so badly I couldn't fill in the bubbles properly. When Mr. Maricy's grad Taylor noticed, he came to my desk, leaning over me with fake concern, his hand on my back in what would look like comfort to anyone watching. But his fingers pressed and moved in ways that made concentration impossible. I failed that test, adding academic failure to my growing list of shameful secrets. By April, I had become an expert at survival. I knew which routes to take through the school to avoid being alone in hallways where he might appear. I knew how to time my bathroom breaks for when he was occupied with other students. I knew how to make myself small and unremarkable, how to fade into the background despite sitting in the front row. But I also knew that no matter how careful I was, he would find ways to continue the abuse. He had made me his prey, and predators don't give up easily. The approaching end of the school year brought a mixture of desperate hope and terrible fear. Hope that I would soon escape his classroom, fear that he would find ways to follow me, to continue his abuse even after 5th grade ended. He had already mentioned to my parents that he also tutored students during the summer, that he would be happy to help me catch up on the areas where I had struggled. The thought of summer sessions with him made me physically ill, but I didn't know how to refuse without raising questions I couldn't answer. As May arrived with its promise of freedom, I had survived 8 months of abuse. 8 months of having my boundaries violated, my trust shattered, my childhood stolen. 8 months of carrying a secret that was eating me alive from the inside. I was no longer the bright, confident child who had walked into room 207 in September. I was a survivor, but I didn't know that word yet. All I knew was that I was tired, so very tired, of pretending everything was okay when nothing would ever be okay again. The weight of silence is something that only those who have carried terrible secrets can truly understand. It presses down on you every waking moment, makes it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to exist in a world where everyone else seems to move so freely. By the time spring was in full bloom, I had been carrying my secret for so long that it had become a part of me, woven into the fabric of who I was becoming. There were so many moments when I almost spoke up, so many times when the words gathered in my throat like birds ready to take flight, only to be swallowed back down into the darkness where they lived. The fear of speaking out wasn't just one fear, it was 1,000 fears tangled together into a knot that seemed impossible to unravel. The first and perhaps strongest fear was that no one would believe me. Mr. Taylor was a pillar of the community. He attended the same church as half the town, including the principal. He coached Little League in the summers. He had been Teacher of the Year twice. His wife was president of the PTA, and his own children were star students who had gone on to successful careers. Who was I compared to all of that? Just a 10-year-old girl whose grades had been slipping, who had become withdrawn and difficult. If it came down to his word against mine, I knew whose story would be believed. I had seen what happened to children who told tales that adults didn't want to hear. My cousin Sarah had tried to tell her parents that her babysitter was mean to her, that the woman had locked her in a closet as punishment. The adults had dismissed it as an overactive imagination, a child's attempt to avoid discipline. It wasn't until years later, when other children came forward, that anyone believed Sarah. By then, the damage was done. I remembered the way the adults had looked at her, with suspicion and disappointment, as if she had done something wrong by speaking up. Then there was the fear of what would happen to my family if I told. My parents were respected in our community. My father worked at the bank, my mother volunteered at the hospital auxiliary. We went to church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew we had occupied for years. If I accused Mr. Taylor, it wouldn't just affect me. My parents would be the parents of the girl who made those terrible accusations. My younger brother would be the boy whose sister caused all that trouble. The shame wouldn't be mine alone to bear, it would splash onto everyone I loved like ink from a broken pen. I imagined the conversations that would happen in grocery store aisles and church parking lots. The whispers that would follow my mother as she tried to go about her daily life. The looks my father would get at work. The way my brother's friends might not be allowed to play with him anymore because their parents wouldn't want them associated with our family. The social isolation that would come from breaking the silence seemed almost as terrifying as maintaining it. There was also the very real fear of not being able to articulate what was happening. I was 10 years old. I didn't have the vocabulary to describe sexual abuse. I knew what was happening was wrong, but I didn't know the words adults would need to hear to take it seriously. How could I explain the way his touches made me feel without sounding like I was overreacting? How could I describe the gradual escalation, the careful grooming, the psychological manipulation? I barely understood it myself. The fear that I would try to tell and fail, that my inadequate words would be dismissed, kept me silent as effectively as any threat. Mr. Taylor had also done an excellent job of making me feel complicit in what was happening. He constantly reminded me that I was special, that I was mature for my age, that this was something that happened between teachers and exceptional students. He made it seem like I had somehow invited this attention, that my intelligence or behavior had marked me as different from other children. The shame of that perceived complicity was paralyzing. How could I tell anyone, when part of me feared they would ask what I had done to encourage him? The fear of consequences was very real. Mr. Taylor never explicitly threatened me. He was too smart for that. But he would make comments that chilled me to the bone. He would mention how disappointed my parents would be if they knew I was spreading lies about him. He would talk about how sad it would be if I had to change schools, leave all my friends behind. He would wonder aloud what would happen to a girl with a reputation for making up stories about teachers. The threats were wrapped in concern, delivered with a sympathetic smile, but I understood them perfectly. I tried once to hint at what was happening to my mother. It was a Saturday morning, and she was folding laundry while I sat on her bed, watching. She was humming something from the radio, content in the domestic routine. I gathered all my courage and said, "Mom, what would you do if someone was doing something bad to a kid?" She paused in folding a towel and looked at me with concern. "What kind of bad thing, sweetie?" My mouth went dry. "Just touching them in ways they don't like." Her face changed, became serious. "Is someone bothering you, Betty? Is someone at school being inappropriate?" This was it. This was my chance. All I had to do was say yes, say his name, and maybe this nightmare would end. But as I opened my mouth, I saw the worry in her eyes turn to something else. Fear. She was afraid of what I might say, afraid of what it might mean. And in that moment, I realized that telling her would hurt her too. It would shatter her world just as mine had been shattered. "No," I lied, the word tasting like ashes. "I just heard some older kids talking about something and I didn't understand." The relief on her face was immediate and devastating. She launched into an age-appropriate talk about good touches and bad touches, about how I should always tell her, or another trusted adult, if anyone made me uncomfortable. The irony of her words, spoken while I sat there drowning in my secret, was almost too much to bear. I nodded at all the right places, assured her I understood, and never brought it up again. The isolation that came with keeping the secret was profound. I watched my friendships deteriorate as I withdrew further into myself. Mary Catherine tried to maintain our friendship, but how could I giggle about boys and movies and normal 10-year-old things when I was living in a nightmare? How could I have sleepovers when I barely slept in my own bed? How could I play games at recess when every moment at school was about survival? I became known as the weird girl, the one who used to be fun but had become strange and distant. Children can be cruel in their honesty, and they didn't hesitate to point out how I had changed. Some thought I had become stuck up, too good for them now that I was teacher's pet. If only they knew how much I would have given to trade places with any of them, to be ignored by Mr. Taylor, to be just another face in the crowd. The fear of speaking out was also tangled up with a desperate hope that maybe it would stop on its own. Maybe he would lose interest. Maybe he would realize what he was doing was wrong and stop. Maybe someone else would notice and intervene without me having to say anything. I clung to these maybes like life rafts in a storm, even as months passed and nothing changed except the escalation of his behavior. I developed elaborate fantasies about being rescued. Sometimes I imagined my parents would surprise me at school and catch him in the act. Sometimes I dreamed that another teacher would walk in at the wrong moment and see what was happening. Sometimes I even fantasized about getting sick enough to be hospitalized, thinking that maybe then I could tell a doctor who would have to believe me. But rescue never came, and the burden of speaking out remained mine alone. As the school year neared its end, the pressure to speak became almost unbearable. I knew that 5th grade would end, but Mr. Taylor had already made it clear he intended to continue his interest in me. The thought of a summer of tutoring sessions, of being alone with him, without even the minimal protection of other students nearby, terrified me beyond words. But still, the fears that had kept me silent all year remained stronger than my desperation to escape. Looking back now, I understand that my silence was not weakness. It was a survival mechanism in a situation where I had no good options. A 10-year-old child should never have to weigh the consequences of speaking out against abuse, should never have to carry the burden of protecting others from the truth of what happened to them. But that was my reality, and the fear of speaking out became just another bar in the prison Mr. Taylor had built around me. Every person who has endured trauma has a breaking point, a moment when the weight of carrying the burden alone becomes heavier than the fear of what might happen if they set it down. For me, that moment came on a humid Thursday in May, just 2 weeks before the end of 5th grade. The day that started like hundreds of others before it would end with me finally finding my voice, though the path to that moment was anything but straight. The morning had been particularly difficult. I had woken up from another nightmare, my sheets soaked with sweat, my heart racing. In the dream, I had been trying to scream, but no sound came out, trying to run, but my feet were stuck to the floor. It was the same dream I had been having for months, but this time it felt different. This time, when I woke up, the frustration of being voiceless in my dream carried over into my waking hours. At breakfast, my mother commented on how thin I had become. She felt my forehead, worried I might be coming down with something. I wanted so badly to tell her that I was sick, just not in the way she thought. I was sick from keeping secrets, sick from pretending, sick from being touched by hands that had no right to touch me. But instead, I mumbled something about not being hungry and escaped to school before she could ask more questions. The walk to school felt different that day. Maybe it was the heavy air that promised thunderstorms later, or maybe it was something shifting inside me, but I felt like I was walking towards something inevitable. Mary Catherine met me at our usual corner, chattering about the end-of-year party plans, but her words seemed to come from very far away. I was trapped inside my own head, watching myself go through the motions of being a normal girl walking to school with her friend. Mr. Taylor seemed agitated when we arrived. He snapped at students for minor infractions, his usual mask of patient teacher slipping to reveal the irritation beneath. When his eyes landed on me, I saw something there that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the usual predatory interest. It was anger. Had I done something wrong? Had someone said something? The uncertainty made my anxiety spike even higher. The morning dragged by with excruciating slowness. Math problems blurred together on the page. Reading comprehension questions might as well have been written in a foreign language. All I could focus on was the tension radiating from Mr. Taylor's desk, the way he kept glancing at me with that unreadable expression. When lunchtime finally arrived, I practically ran from the classroom. But I couldn't eat. I sat in the cafeteria, staring at my tray of food, my stomach churning. Around me, children laughed and talked, living their normal lives, unaware that one of their classmates was drowning right in front of them. The isolation felt particularly acute in that moment, surrounded by people but completely alone with my secret. When we returned to class, Mr. Taylor announced that we would be working on final presentations for our science projects. Students would present throughout the afternoon, and he would be calling us up randomly. My project on the water cycle sat in my desk, carefully prepared despite everything, because maintaining normal appearances had become as automatic as breathing. Halfway through the afternoon, during Jennifer Morrison's presentation on photosynthesis, Mr. Taylor called me to his desk. My legs felt like jelly as I walked to the front of the room. He spoke quietly, so only I could hear, telling me to stay after school to discuss my project. His hand reached out and gripped my wrist, not hard enough to leave a mark but firm enough to convey possession. And something inside me finally snapped. "No," I said. The word came out louder than I intended. Jennifer stopped mid-sentence, and every head in the classroom turned to look at us. Mr. Taylor's grip on my wrist tightened, and his face flushed with anger. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I said no, I repeated, my voice shaking but determined. "I won't stay after school. I won't stay alone with you anymore." The classroom was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Jennifer stood frozen at the front of the room, her poster on photosynthesis forgotten. 23 pairs of eyes moved between Mr. Taylor and me, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. Mr. Taylor recovered quickly, too quickly. He released my wrist and forced a laugh. "Betty is just tired," he told the class. "End-of-year stress. Betty, please sit down. We'll discuss your behavior later." But I didn't sit down. I stood there, shaking like a leaf but still standing. "No," I said for the third time. "I won't discuss anything with you, not alone, not ever again." His face went from red to white. "Sit down, Betty, now." I turned and walked back to my desk, but I didn't sit. Instead, I grabbed my books, my unfinished science project, my pencil case. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my eraser, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I headed for the door. "Where do you think you're going?" Mr. Taylor's voice had lost all pretense of calm. "To the principal's office," I said, my hand on the doorknob. "To tell Mrs. Henderson what you've been doing to me all year." The gasp from my classmates was audible. Mr. Taylor started to move toward me, but I was already out the door, running down the hallway like my life depended on it. Behind me, I could hear him calling my name, could hear the classroom erupting in confused voices, but I didn't stop. I burst into the principal's office without knocking. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her desk, startled. Her secretary, Mrs. Bloom, half rose from her chair. I must have looked wild, with my face flushed and tears streaming down my cheeks that I hadn't even realized had started falling. "Betty, what on earth is wrong?" Mrs. Henderson asked, coming around her desk. And finally, the words came pouring out. Not perfectly, not eloquently, but real and raw and true. I told her about the touches, the after-school sessions, the way he made me feel dirty and scared. I told her about the nightmares, the weight loss, the constant fear. I told her about trying to be good, trying to handle it alone, trying to protect everyone else from the ugly truth. Halfway through my fractured confession, Mr. Taylor appeared in the doorway. His face was composed again, his teacher mask firmly in place. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson. Betty has been having some behavioral issues lately. I'll take her back to class." "No!" The word tore from my throat. "Don't let him take me. Please, please don't let him take me." Mrs. Henderson looked between us, and I saw the moment when doubt crossed her face. This was it. This was when she would choose to believe him over me, when my worst fears would come true. But then she looked at me again, really looked, and something in my face must have convinced her. "Mr. Taylor, please return to your classroom," she said quietly. "Mrs. Bloom will supervise until we sort this out. Betty, come sit down, you're safe here." Safe. The word broke something open inside me, and I collapsed into the chair, sobbing like I hadn't allowed myself to sob in months. Mrs. Henderson closed the door, shutting out Mr. Taylor's protests, and sat beside me. She didn't rush me, didn't push for more details. She just sat there, a steady presence, while I fell apart. Eventually, she called my parents. I heard her side of the conversation, careful and professional, asking them to come to school immediately. Then she called another teacher to continue supervising Mr. Sach. Taylor's class. And then, even though I begged her not to, she called the police. My parents arrived within minutes, my mother's face white with fear, my father's jaw clenched with an emotion I couldn't identify. When they saw me, saw the state I was in, my mother rushed to gather me in her arms, and for the first time in months, I didn't flinch from being touched. I collapsed against her, feeling like a very small child again. The rest of that day passed in a blur of conversations with soft-voiced police officers, a trip to the hospital for an examination I don't like to remember, and lots of tears from my parents as they grappled with how they had missed the signs. But through it all, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long: relief. The secret was out. I had found my voice, and while I knew the road ahead would be difficult, I was no longer walking it alone. Mr. Taylor was arrested that evening. The news spread through our small town like wildfire. And in the days that followed, 2 other girls came forward, girls who had been his students in previous years, girls who had carried their own secrets in silence. My breaking point had become a breakthrough, not just for me but for others who had suffered in silence. Finding my voice that day didn't fix everything. The trauma didn't magically disappear, and the healing process would take years. But it was the beginning of reclaiming my life, of learning that speaking truth to power, even when your voice shakes, even when you're just a 10-year-old girl against a respected adult, is possible. And sometimes, that's all the courage we need to break free.